Welcome back to our Vue, Vuetify and Firebase meetup project. We added a lot of features already, we're nearing the end of the project, but some things are still missing. In this video, I want to make our meetups editable. Right now we can create them, we can view them, but what if we wanted to change them after they've been created? Let's take a closer look at that in this video. Let's have a look at where I would want to edit a meetup. For that, I'll first of all sign in with the account I created earlier. And then I can obviously organize a meetup, but if I view meetups and I visit an individual meetup, it would be nice if I could have some buttons here which allow me to edit the meetup. And now that I see it, there seems to be a bug. The location is missing there. Okay, so little change of plan. Let's edit this, or let's fix this by going to the meetup.vue file. And here, meetup location, that's not working. Why is it not working? Let's have a look at our meetup here in the database. We do have the location, looks right to me, meetup. So that should really work in my opinion. Though the issue probably is in the store. There, when we load the meetups, I simply don't store the location locally. So we fetch it, but if I don't store it in the store, we can't use it in our views. So let's set location equal to object key location here, because we do have it in the data, so we'd probably also use it. And now here we'll get an error. I'll come back to that error too, but here we see location is displayed. Now the error here on the right is stemming from the fact that data needs to be fetched, and when it first wants to load or render this page, the data isn't there yet. By the way, that's the same reason why under Vue meetups, if you reload that page, you see the original two meetups first before they get replaced with San Francisco, because we have that loading period. Now we can get rid of that by showing a spinner. Same is true here on the front page where we already do show one. But I don't really want to add this spinner for now. We'll do this later. For now, what I want to do is I want to make a meetup editable. So here, the San Francisco meetup. Would be nice to have some buttons to add it. And for that, I'll create new components in the meetup folder. We have the create meetup component, meetup and meetups. Now I'll create a new subfolder in there and I will name it edit. Now of course you can choose any name you like. In there I'll create a new file, the edit meetup details dialog.vue file. You can give it any other name. This will be my component name because it should open as a dialog, so as a modal basically, where the user is able to edit the details of the meetup. Now with details I mean things like title or description. I'll make the time and date also editable, but I want to show these in a separate modal, which should open on a different button, which I want to place maybe next to the time and date, somewhere down here. So let's go with the general details first. I opened this new .vue file, and there I of course need a template to have something to work with. Now in the template I will use a special Vuetify component. Let's open the Vuetify documentation to find out which one this is. There under documentation you see that under components we actually have dialogs. Now dialogs are looking like that. There are different versions of it, so basically these are modals we can use. I want to use such a dialog, a little bit of a more complex one. And of course feel free to dive into the documentation to find out how you may fine-tune it to your needs. I'll go back to my template here and I'll add vDialog, which actually is the selector for that component. On that, I'll set a width and I'll set it to 350 pixels, which should look good on all devices. Of course, you could also style this and make a real responsive design where the width of this dialog changes with the device width. I'll take the cheap way here. And I'll set it to persistent. This will basically influence how it is displayed and how we may dismiss it. Now, with that added, the first thing we actually add is the button which will open it. That is how Vuetify dialogs work. You have a so-called activator. That is a V button, with dash in between though. So a normal Vuetify button. I'll make it a floating button, give it the accent color, and here important, we have to assign a slot where this should go in. Now keep in mind, I'm nesting this in vDialog. So by assigning a slot here, Vuetify knows where to place this button inside of the dialog, which is actually not inside of the dialog because the dialog is the modal. So we nested into this vDialog component, but behind the scenes, that actually consists of two parts, the modal you see, and a different part where you can place the button on the normal page, so outside of the modal. This is where the button will go in, and I mark this button as please put it in there with the slot which I set to activator. Don't mistype here because activator is understood by Vuetify and which will place the button correctly. Now on the button here, I'll add a V icon. So maybe the added icon sounds appropriate. Now let's already see how it looks even though no dialog was added. So for that, I'll go to the meetup.vue file, which is where I want to use it at the end. And here I of course want to register it and use it in my template. For that, I could register it as a local component in that file, which would be fine because I only added there. Or to see that again, in the main.js file, I can register it as a global component, which I can use application-wide. I'll give it a selector of app, edit, meetup, details, dialog, a relatively long selector, but it's fine for me here. And of course, I should import it. So I will import the edit meetup details dialog from /components, meetup, edit, and then this newly created .vue file we created a few seconds ago, like that. So that's the import. That is what I want to store here in this newly created component. Whoops, without semicolons, of course. And with that added here, I can go back to the meetup.vue file and add it here too. There, I want to add it next to the title. So after my h6 tag here, so to say. I can do this by adding a template tag here because I only want to show this if the user who's logged in is the creator of that specific meetup here. So for now, I'll quickly set if here to true to always show it, but later I'll exchange this to make sure that only the creator of that meetup can see that button, because of course no one else should be able to edit it. Then I'll add vSpacer in there. That's a placeholder provided by Vuetify, which will nicely distribute it so that the title sits on the left and the button goes on the right. So after vSpacer, I'll actually add my component. App edit meetup details dialog was the selector, and that actually is all for now. Now let me save this and see if it works like that. If we go back to the application, we see the button here. Now the style of the button isn't exactly what I wanted though. I don't want to have a button like that, so let's quickly have a look at it again. Having a look at the documentation helps. Turns out this changed to fab, so it's not floating, it's fab, what I want here. So now if I reload, this is the button I wanted. Now I got this edit button here on the right. And now, of course, I want to make sure that I only see it if I am the creator of that meetup. I can easily find this out because if we have a look at the store, our Vue.js store, at our getters, we see we can get the user here. And the user, of course, will have an ID. We can see this in the sign user in method. Here we store the user ID on the user object in our state. Now each meetup also has a creator ID here. Here also for the ones we fetched. So I only have to match if creator ID matches user ID. Therefore, I'll go back to that meetup.vue file and I'll add a new computed property. Actually, I'll add two. The first one is user is authenticated because I also want to check this too. If the user is authenticated, then this will change if we can register later on. So I can already add this since I'll also need it in my other check. And here in user is authenticated, I simply return this store getters user and check if it's not equal to null. And if this store getters user is not equal to undefined, which basically means the user is set, so we are authenticated, otherwise it wouldn't be set in our store. Now I'll add the other computed property which we need to make sure that we only show the button to the creator of that meetup. Here I'll name it user is creator. So that's the name of my computed property. And here I'll first of all check if we're not authenticated. So if user is authenticated is false, don't execute this as a method. I'm simply referring to this computed property. If it is false, I'll return false, because if the user isn't authenticated, I certainly don't want to show this this button. But then I'll also return this store getters user ID. So getting the ID of the currently authenticated user. And I'll check if this is equal to this meetup creator ID. This meetup refers to the meetup computed property, so to the loaded meetup. And get rid of these semicolons, we don't need them. Do I have one here too? No. So that should work. Now we can use the user is creator check in VF. Only show this if the user is the creator, if that returns true. So let's now reload this. And we still see the button. Now let's check if it works correctly. If I sign up another user who clearly won't be the creator then. If I now explore the meetups, we don't see the edit button. So this is working. Now I'll sign in with the other user again, because now I want to work on the actual modal we open. Because right now if I click this, nothing is happening. Well, almost nothing. We see the backdrop already, but of course the modal content is missing because we haven't configured anything about it. You also see I can't dismiss it by clicking on the backdrop because I set the style to persistent here. This directive here, this property. So now let's work on the dialog again. For that, below the button, I'll add a vcard. So the button goes into the activator slot. It's kind of a special thing. The rest of this vdialog content here basically will be what actually gets displayed in the modal. And I want to show a card. Now there, I simply want to have a title to begin with, but to stay in line with my other cards, like the sign up here, I'll also use vlayout in that card to structure it, vcontainer and so on. So let's start with that. Let's add vcontainer here. And in that, let's add vlayout. And this shall be a row which wraps if necessary, which shouldn't be necessary. In there, we can then use vflex. And just like we did before in the other components, vflex also needs to get a property defining when this should be shown. Here, I want to use XS12. Should be one layout for all sizes. Now in there, I'll add vcard title. And on the title, I'll say added meetup. I then want to add a new row, vlayout, also row and wrap, with vflex x12 to use that grid here, where I want to show the text to the actual content. In between, why don't we add a vdivider? Here we'll have the content. Let's see how that looks like if I save this. We already see it. This is roughly what it will look like. Not that pretty yet, but we'll get there. We'll get there by now working on the content in there. Here I'll add vcard text inside this row here we created with the grid. And in vcard text, I now want to have text fields which allow me to edit the title and the description. For that, of course, we can go to create meetup and get inspired from there. At least here we already have text fields for the description and for the title. So why don't we pick the text field for the title here, go back to the dialog and enter that, and do the same, here from create meetup, for the description, which is a multi-line text field. So I picked these two and I add them right below each other, beneath each other here in my vcard text element. Now vmodel is bound to title and description here. That won't work for now, so I'll get rid of it. And now let's see how that looks like in our modal. Well, it doesn't look too bad to me. Added meetup, title, description. That doesn't look too bad. Now, of course, this is not really editable yet though. So before we take care about these values actually being used somewhere, I also want to have actions in that modal. So below the row here, which holds my input fields, I'll add another vdivider, simply a horizontal line, add another layout, which should be a row and wrap, and we flex in there axis 12, where I now want to add my actions. Now we can have a look at the card component here to find out how we add actions. You see we got we card actions here basically. So the code can be seen here, we card actions with buttons in there. So let's add we card actions here, just like that, just using this component. And in there, let's add buttons. One maybe for canceling the changes and one for accepting them. So I'll add a button. And now it's totally up to you how you style it. I want to use the flat style, but I want to use my own class. I want to give it a blue text with the darken one, modification basically. And of course, choose any styling, any color you want. I'll see if I stick to that, but for now I want to go with that. I'll give this a name of close, duplicate it, and add a save button too. Now I'll add click listeners soon. Let's have a look at the modal first. Looks pretty good to me. Close and save. Now it's time to make sure that we actually handle these inputs and that we do something with that. For that, I'll add a script tag here to my component. And there I'll export a default object where, first of all, I want to set up my data. In the data property, or in the object returned there to be precise, I want to have my edited title, which is an empty string initially, and my edited description, which is an empty string initially. So this is what I want to get back. Now, actually, it would be nice if we could pre-populate the text fields with the actual values of that meetup, because we're editing it, so there are existing values. To do that, we of course need to get the meetup we want to add. I expect to get this via props. So props here should give me the meetup. And then we could try to set edited title equal to this meetup title and the description equal to this meetup description. Let's see if that works as we want it to work. Now for that, of course, we need to pass a meetup. We do this from the meetup.vue file, which is where I use the edit dialog. And there I can bind meetup, the prop we just configured, to the meetup we have here. So to the loaded meetup in the meetup.vue file, just like that. So meetup here in front of the equal sign refers to the prop name we assigned here. Let's save this and see if it works as expected. If I click this button, maybe reload the app before we do so, we see it doesn't work. Now the reason for this is that at the point of time we're assigning this, the meetup hasn't been loaded yet. So a different way for us to handle this is to ensure that we only load this dialog, this component here I should say, once the meetup has been loaded. This goes back to the same problem we had before, that when I reload this, we get the error here initially. Now to avoid that, all we have to do is we have to basically add a loader and only render the meetup if the data is there. Now we can easily do that. We already do it in the home component. There we have a loader here in Vue layout where I check if we're loading, and if we're loading, we actually display the loader here. So I'll copy that code over to the meetup.vue file, and I'll add it right at the top, vContainer. This is a row wrapping. Now I won't add it here, I'll add VF to the whole Vue layout instead. And I'll check is loading. Now clearly, I don't have a isLoading property in the meetup.vue file yet. But in the home.vue file where we already used this, we simply have loading and we get it from the store. Now obviously we can do the same in our meetup.vue file. So I'll copy the computed property from the home.vue file, the loading one, and I'll add it here, loading. So now I can use loading, not isLoading, loading up here. And I only load the Vue layout here in the VElse case. I can use VElse here because I have VIF on the same type of element on the same level of nesting. So here Vue layout with VIF, here Vue layout with VElse. So now we should see the loader as long as we are loading. Let's see if that works. Indeed, that works. Now if we open the dialog, still no title and description. The reason for that is simple. We have added the title and description, but we're not binding to it here. So we should add vModel on the title input field and bind it to edited title. And for the other one, the multi-line input field for the description, I should bind vModel to edited description, like that. Now with that, if I reload that and now click this button, we see it's pre-populated with the values we already had. That's awesome. Now the only thing we have to do is make these buttons work and actually take these changes and do something with them, which of course is a big step. We'll have to reach out to the web for that again. So to make sure that we can submit this, we need click listeners on these buttons. On the close button, I want to listen to a click listener and simply close that modal. And on the save listener, I also want to close the modal, but of course I then also want to save the data. So here I will say on-save changes should get executed. For closing the modal, I have an easier way though. I can create a new data property, so storing in that object I return data, and I'll name it edit dialog, referring to that whole dialog. I'll set it to false initially, and I will assign it to my overall vDialog element. This is supported by the vDialog component by Vuetify. We can bind it to a boolean to determine whether to show it or not. The activator will automatically show it, automatically set this to true, but we can always disable it by setting it back to false. So here I can set vModal equal to edit dialog. Yeah, edit dialog. Again, this will be turned to true by the activator button. But if we set it back to false, the modal will disappear. And I do just that here in the close click event. Edit dialog will be set to false here. Let me split this over multiple lines to make this a bit easier to read. Now if I save this and go back and reload the application here, yeah, we get that on-save changes is of course not a method, we'll add it soon. But we also get that if I click on close, we close the modal. So that works. Now let's take care about this error and add on-save changes. We're executing it here when we click save, so we need to add it here as a method. So let's add the methods key and add on-save changes, like that. Now in on-save changes, I obviously want to close the modal, which I can do by setting this edit dialog equal to false, following the same logic we use on the close button here. I also want to make sure that I don't take the changes if they're invalid though. So if I have like an empty string in either of the two. So here I will check if this added the title trim to remove any excess white space, if that is equal to an empty space, or if this edited description trimmed by excess white space is empty. If either is the case, I want to return. So we don't continue then, I don't want to do anything with invalid values. Let's check if that works. Click the button, empty that and click save. Can't submit it. Type something, I can. Now of course, this is not stored or is not doing anything yet, but this is the next step I want to do. I want to submit the changed values to the server. Now for that we need a new method, a new action in our store. And by the way, I will also in a later video optimize everything and split the store into multiple modules. So there I now want to update a module. Let's maybe add that code below create. I'll name it update meetup data. There we'll get the object where we can extract commit, and we'll get a payload, basically an object which holds the new data we want to store. Now, first of all, I want to commit set loading to true, because I am loading. If I use that or not, I want to set it to true here. Then I want to create a new constant and update object, which is an empty new JavaScript object initially. We'll use it soon. I then want to check if we have a title in that payload. If we do have that on that update object, I'll set the title equal to the payload title. I don't want to do that without any check, because if the payload title is not present for some reason, because we're not changing it, I don't want to override the existing valid title with an invalid one. So therefore, I'll also check the same for the description, which is another thing we could change. If we have a description, I want to set the description property on that update object equal to payload description. And finally for the date, because that will be the last thing we can edit. Not right now, but in the future. If the payload date is existing, I want to set update object date equal to payload date. So now we have a configured update object. It could be empty if we somehow commit this or dispatch this action without any payload, or a payload which does have neither a title nor a description nor a date. But in most cases, we will probably set some of these properties. With that, I can reach out to Firebase and there to Meetups. So the same path we use when creating Meetups, of course. You can, by the way, add these slashes or not. So since I didn't use them up there, I'll remove them down here too. Then I want to access a specific Meetup, of course. We can do this with child and access payload ID. Now I expect to get the ID as an argument in the payload too, or as a property to be precise. And with that, we can call update. Now, the cool thing about update is it will not override the existing object. It will only override the properties which need to be overwritten. And it decides which these are depending on the data we pass to it. In this case, the update object. So if the update object has a title property, it will override the existing title property, but leave the other properties unchanged. Which is why I do the update like this. Have an empty object initially. If we would pass that, nothing would change on the server. But if we, for example, have a title, because the payload held a title, then we will change it on the server too. This is what update does here. And of course, it's Firebase database. Whoops, database ref, like that. Important to add that. Now, as before, this gives us a promise where we can listen to the success case. In this case, I want to set loading to false because we're not loading anymore. And I want to commit this change. I want to also change it in my local store. So for that, I'll create a new mutation because right now we only have the action. I'll add it below create meetup. I'll name it update meetup data, or just update meetup to be in line with create meetup. There I'll get my state and a payload. Payload will be the new meetup data. And now in there, I will basically update my meetup with that meetup data. So first of all, I need to fetch the meetup which should be changed. I'll get it from my state. There I have my loaded meetups. And there I want to find a given meetup. I'll find it by ID. So the arrow function here, which will return me a meetup, should simply check if the ID of the meetup I'm currently looking at in that array of meetups matches my payload ID. This is the ID of the meetup which should get updated. So that will give me the meetup I wanna change, I wanna update. There I then want to check. If we have a title following the same logic as before, then I wanna change meetup title to be the payload title. And I'll repeat this for description and date. If we have a description here in the payload, I want to update payload description and set it meetup description and set it equal to payload description. And lastly, also for the date. If we have a date in the payload, then I want to set meetup date equal to payload date to update that. So this is the logic in my mutation. I'll fetch a meetup and then I'll change only what I need to change. For that, I check if that's a title, description, or date, if any of these is present in the payload. With that, I'm updating that. I have my mutation. It's named update meetup. So down in the update meetup action, I can commit this to, commit this newly created mutation, update meetup. And of course, I need to pass the payload there because the payload contains the data and we want to edit the data, so it makes sense to pass it to it. Finally, I also want to catch any errors. Here in that case, I will console log the error so that we get any insights. And of course, I still want to commit something. I want to set loading to false, because even if we've gotten an error, the loading still is done. So that was a lot of work. Now we got this update meetup data action set up. Back to the update meetup details dialog. We can now dispatch this here. So there I will reach out to my store and call dispatch and dispatch this newly created action. Now we need to pass some data there. And what do we expect to get? Let's have a look at that store again. In the action, we're using the title, description, date, and the ID. These are the things we try to access on the payload. Now it's okay if some of them are missing. That's why I have the checks here, the if checks. The ID is needed in all cases though. So let's make sure to pass the ID. The ID can simply be retrieved, of course, from the loaded meetup ID. That's the ID stored in Firebase already, and that obviously is the ID by which we can identify it. Now we'll also have a title here, this editable edited title, and of course we can also pass the description, because even if we didn't change it, it's still the original one, so we can safely overwrite it. So here I'll set description equal to this edited description, like that. With that I'm dispatching the action and I'm passing this object. Now let's see if that works. I'm reloading this and I'm opening up in Firebase. So here that's this meetup with awesome as a description. Let's change the description to really awesome. And let's hit save. Let's have a look at the meetup. Really awesome as a description. Let's change the title too, just to see if that works. Maybe it's the San Francisco meetup. Let's hit save and let's switch to Firebase here. And we see the San Francisco meetup. So this is working. Let's also try something else. If I empty this and I hit save, it doesn't get closed. And here nothing changed. If I close it like that, nothing changes. And if I reload that and I actually don't change anything but hit save, it gets submitted, but here you see nothing changed. So this is how we can edit the meetup. Of course, thus far, only the title and description. In the next video, we'll have a look at how we can edit date and time. See you there. Bye.